I will begin with the disclaimer the board has requested, and then I will not mention it again. I am not here to defend the program. I am here to explain what the program found. Those are different obligations, and I intend to honor both of them with the same precision I brought to the work itself. If the board determines at the close of this testimony that the program should remain suspended, I will accept that determination. If the board determines that the program should be dissolved entirely and its findings sealed, I will accept that as well. I have made my peace with outcomes. What I have not made peace with, what I suspect I will not make peace with for the remainder of my career is possibility that we will seal those findings before anyone in this building has fully understood what they mean. So, let me tell you what we found. My name is Orith Seln. I hold the rank of Senior Research Director within the Dominion Neurocognitive Institute, dual appointments to the Vethori Biological Suppression Division, and the Carath-Venn Alliance's Interspecies Compatibility Office. I have spent 31 years studying how minds are organized, not what they think, but how they are built, how they store, how they degrade, and how they can be altered. Suppression science is a narrow specialty within that broader field. Most of my colleagues find it distasteful. I have always found it clarifying, because the best way to understand a structure is to attempt to dismantle it and observe what resists. The subject was brought to my facility on the 43rd day of his captivity. His name, as it appeared in the Dominion transfer documents, Terran Expeditionary Corps Logistics Officer Davin Holt, serial designation 7 Alpha 911, captured intact during the Kovari Corridor action 8 months prior to the program's commencement. I will call him Holt throughout this testimony. That is what my team called him, because we asked him his name on the first day, and he told us, and using a subject designation felt, under the circumstances, like a category error. I will explain what I mean by that phrase as we proceed. Holt was 34 years old by Terran reckoning, 179 centimeters, 81 kilograms. He had sustained a minor fracture to the right orbital socket during capture, which had healed without intervention in 11 days. I note this not because it is relevant to my specific findings, because it was the first time I had observed human healing at close range, and I recorded it in my notes with some attention. He'd been in standard holding for 43 days before transfer. During that time, he had been assessed by the detention authorities' standard intake protocols, had cooperated fully with all requests, had asked consistently and without complaint for reading material, and had taught himself to play the Orvith Kaln tactical tile game using pieces he fashioned from his ration packaging. The guard who processed his transfer told me this last detail with an expression I can only describe as fond exasperation. I noted that as well. On the first day of his residency at the Institute, before any procedure, I conducted an intake assessment. This is standard practice. A full cognitive baseline across all dimensions before any intervention, so that subsequent changes can be measured with precision. I want to describe the assessment and its results, because they are relevant context for everything that followed. Holt sat across the intake table with the easy, alert quality of a person who is comfortable being observed. He did not appear nervous. He did not perform cooperation. There is a difference, and after 3 decades in this field, I can reliably identify it. He was genuinely, plainly at ease, with the specific quality of ease that comes not from indifference, but from a settled relationship to one's own circumstances. He looked at the assessment instruments with open curiosity. He answered every question I asked him directly and without omission, including questions whose answers might reasonably be considered unfavorable to his situation. When I asked him if he understood that the assessment was not a courtesy, he said yes, he understood that, and that he was answering honestly anyway, because lying in an intelligence-gathering context is a waste of everyone's time when the other party has instruments. His baseline scores across all cognitive dimensions were at the upper end of the variance range we had documented from our 3 prior human cadaver specimens, higher than those specimens, obviously, since those specimens were not living and were not performing, higher than we had projected, even accounting for the difference between a structural map and a functioning assessment. Verbal processing speed, memory load, abstract pattern performance, novel analogy construction, all at what I would characterize, in a veterinary subject, as professionally exceptional. I recorded this carefully, because it is the kind of data that later becomes significant. At the close of the intake assessment, I asked him if he had NT questions. He asked how long the program was expected to run. I told him I was not at liberty to discuss program parameters. He said that was understandable, and asked if there was any chance of getting the tile pieces back, or an equivalent set, since the one he had fashioned in holding had been confiscated at transfer. I told him I would see what I could arrange, he said. Thank you. I have a version I cannot test with 2 players, and I think the rule modifications are sound, but I need to play it a few times to know for sure. I want to note, and I will return to this observation later, that this was not a performance of equanimity. I am experienced enough to recognize performed equanimity. It has a slight tightness to it, a quality of effort. What Holt had was the real thing. He was a person who had been detained for 43 days, transferred to a facility whose purpose was not explained to him, subjected to a comprehensive cognitive baseline assessment by a researcher who had declined to describe the program's parameters, and his immediate practical concern was the verification of his tile game rule modifications. That is not coping. That is genuine organizational composure. His mind had filed the situation appropriately, assigned appropriate weight to the controllable, and appropriate acceptance to the uncontrollable, and returned to the next item on the list. I noted that in the intake record and went home thinking about it. I should say clearly, before I describe the work, that Holt was not harmed in the ordinary meaning of that word. He was not subjected to physical pain. He was not deprived of food, water, adequate sleep, or the environmental condition specified in the interspecies treatment compact. Every intervention I will describe was non-invasive by the standards of our field. Electromagnetic induction, focused resonance arrays, subthreshold neural pattern delivery systems. Techniques that act on the electromagnetic architecture of the brain without cutting, burning, or damaging tissue in the recoverable sense. I make this clear not to diminish what I did, because the board needs to understand that what we observed was not the result of the brain defending itself against injury. It was the result of the brain doing something else entirely, something more interesting and considerably more troubling. And I need you to understand that distinction before I describe what happened. The Vittori Cognitive Null Mapping Protocol, hereafter simply the Null Map, was developed 40 years ago and has been in active use for 32 of those years. It works as follows. The brain, in every known species, organizes its higher-order identity functions. The continued autobiographical self, the value-weighting system, the goal hierarchy that directs motivated behavior, in a set of primary integration nodes. These nodes are not single structures. They are distributed networks, but they have hub points. Locations where the density of integration is high enough that disrupting them disrupts the whole. The null map uses a sequenced electromagnetic pulse array to identify those hub points, map them precisely, and then deliver a targeted suppression field that does not destroy tissue, but rather interrupts the coherent oscillation pattern that allows those nodes to function as an integrated network. The hubs still exist, the connections still exist, but the signal that binds them into a continuous self, the standing wave of identity, if you will permit a slightly poetic formicidi, is cancelled. The result, in 34 species over 32 years of documented application, has been consistent. The subject loses access to autobiographical memory. Not the memory traces themselves, but the capacity to assemble them into a continuous narrative. They lose the motivational architecture that generates autonomous goal pursuit. They become, functionally, present-moment reactive only. They respond to stimulus. They perform instructed tasks competently. They eat when fed and sleep when left undisturbed. The technical term in our field is null state. Subjects in null state have retained full motor function, full language function, and full sensory processing. They are not vegetables. They are simply no longer directed from within. The effect is permanent in 34 species. Permanent in the sense that no recovery has ever been documented without intervention, and no recovery has ever been documented with intervention either. Null state, once achieved, is the terminal condition of the cognitive architecture. It is not a sleep from which one wakes. It is a reorganization into a stable lower-order configuration. I want you to hold that phrase, stable lower-order configuration, because I will return to it. We ran the null map on Holt on day 3 of his residency at the Institute. The procedure took 4 hours and 11 minutes. His neural architecture, as rendered by our mapping arrays, was unusually dense, not pathological, simply at the upper end of the baseline variation we had observed in the 3 prior human cadaver specimens we had mapped for structural reference. More hub points than the average Vithori brain, more interhub connective density. My lead technician, Pether Velm, noted in her log that the map looked like a city that had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt twice on the same foundation. I found that description evocative enough to include in my own notes. The null map procedure proceeded without complication. Post-procedure scans confirmed successful suppression of all primary integration nodes. Holt was unresponsive to his own name for 6 hours afterward, showed no goal-directed behavior, made no requests, did not ask for his reading material. He ate when the meal was placed before him. He sat without apparent discomfort. His eyes tracked movement in the room, but without the particular quality that I can only describe, imprecisely, as the quality of being looked at by someone who is also looking back. I went home that night, believing the protocol had succeeded. On the morning of day 4, 17 hours after the procedure, Pether Velm called me before the early session had begun. Voice on the communications line had a quality I had not heard from her before. She had been my lead technician for 9 years. She is not a person who uses the word strange lightly, she said. He asked for his reading material. I told her to run a full scan immediately and not to process the request until I arrived. The scan showed the following. The primary integration nodes remained suppressed. The null map had done precisely what it was supposed to do, but in the 17 hours since the procedure, something else had occurred. The connective pathways between the suppressed nodes, the lines of high-density fiber-tracked communication that the null map does not target because, in 34 species, they are irrelevant post-suppression. Those pathways had begun carrying the integration signal themselves, not at the same frequency, not with the same fidelity, but with enough fidelity to sustain goal-directed behavior and autobiographical reference. To use an analogy that I employed with my team, and will employ here, the null map had switched off the city's central power plant, and the city had rewired itself to run on the distribution lines. I will be precise about the timeline, because precision is what makes this remarkable. 17 hours. In a brain that had just had its primary identity integration architecture suppressed by a procedure that has terminated the continuous self in 34 species permanently. 17 hours. I should also note, because the board's technical committee will ask, and I would rather address it now, that we ran the post-reconstitution scan 4 additional times across that day, with different arrays and different resolution settings. Confirm we were not reading an instrumentation artifact. We were not. The signal was present and consistent and growing. By hour 30, coherence index had risen to 72% of baseline. By hour 40, it was at 90%. By hour 48, it had stabilized at 97%, which is within the measurement noise of the instrument. To all practical purposes, baseline. Pether Velm asked me what we should do. I told her to give him the reading material. Then I asked her to set up a conversation log, because I wanted a record. Holt read for 2 hours. Then he asked through the communication panel whether anyone was going to come talk to him. He said, and I am reading directly from the log. I know someone's watching. You can come in. I don't bite. And I've been good about not mapping your facility this time. He paused. Then he said, that's a joke, mostly. I went in. I sat across the table from him. I had done this with no expectation of what I would find, because nothing in my training had prepared me to expect anything in particular. His face was present. That is the word I keep returning to. Present. The quality I had noted its absence of on day 4 was back, and it was not partial. He looked at me the way a person looks at another person, with the specific, calibrated attention of someone who is assembling an impression and has opinions about what they find. He said, "You're the one in charge." I asked him how he knew that. He said, "The others defer to you even when you're not in the room."
You can
by how they position themselves when they think you're about to walk in. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him how he was feeling. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, with the brief inward quality of someone checking rather than performing, and said, like I had a long dream and can't quite remember it. The dream isn't bothering me. I remember everything before it fine. He paused again. You tried something, didn't you? Something with the lights. I told him I had run a routine assessment. He nodded as though this was a satisfactory enough answer. He didn't push. He asked again about the reading material. I want to be precise about my internal state at that moment, because the board might find it relevant to the decisions that followed. I was not frightened. I am a scientist. What I was, the honest word is unsettled. The null map had succeeded, and then ceased to have succeeded, in a subject who was now sitting across a table from me, conducting an accurate behavioral analysis of my team, with no indication that anything had occurred. The brain had not recovered in any sense I recognized. It had done something else. It had rerouted. And the reroute had produced, as far as any external assessment could determine, the same person who had been there before. I told the board, the internal review board I convened the following morning, that we were dealing with a calibration anomaly and that we would run an adjusted protocol within the week. I want to be honest, I told myself the same thing. The adjusted protocol was the deep structure resonance ablation procedure. If the null map targets the hub points, the DSRA targets the physical substrate one level deeper, the myelin sheaths of the high-density inter-hub connective pathways, the distribution, lines the brain had used to reroute. DSRA delivers a patterned resonance field that disrupts the myelin's conductive geometry without destroying the underlying axon. The affect is conduction at signal transmission speed along those pathways, too slow to sustain high frequency integration, which is what identity network coherence requires. The hub points remain suppressed by the prior null map. The rerouted pathways are now too slow to carry the signal that replaced them. The brain cannot integrate. DSRI has been used 11 times in the program's history, always as a follow-up to anomalous null map results. It has succeeded 11 times. The slowest recovery to null state after DSRA was 40 minutes. We ran DSRA on day 9. I want to describe the day before the procedure, because it belongs in the record. On day 8, Pether Veln had in fact obtained a tile set from the Institute's recreation supplies, a standard Orvith Kaln board game, 3-player edition. She had told me about it in a slightly defensive tone, as though anticipating that I might find it professionally inappropriate. I had told her to use her judgment. She had, with some apparent trepidation, taken it to the session room, explained to Holt that she had the 3-player version, and wasn't sure his 2-player modification would transfer, and asked him to explain the rules. Told me afterward that the session ran 2 hours longer than her scheduled observation window. She told me this in the same slightly defensive tone, and then she said, "He's right that the modifications work. I lost 3 times, but the game was balanced." And then, quietly, "He's very patient with someone who doesn't know the rules." I noted this in my records. I noted it because patience, genuine, instructional patience, freely offered to a person who is in every formal sense his captor, is a data point. I was not sure then what it was a data point for. I have since developed a theory, which I'll share with the board when I reach that point in my testimony. The DSRA procedure took 6 hours. Post-procedure scans confirmed mild disruption across 62% of the targeted pathway network, within normal parameters for the procedure, slightly above average for a subject of Holt's brain density. His integration function dropped to near 0 on the scan. He was unresponsive to his name again. He sat and ate and did not ask for his reading material. I went home. I told myself we had corrected the calibration anomaly. On day 11, 38 hours after the DSRA procedure, Pether Veln called again. Voice had the same quality as before, except that this time there was something underneath it that I can only describe as the tone of a person who has begun to suspect that what they are looking at is not what they thought it was. She said, "He's asking for the reading material again." I did not answer immediately. She waited. I said, "Run the full stack. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The scan was the most remarkable thing I had seen in 31 years in this field. I will describe it as accurately as I can, and I acknowledge that words are an imperfect tool for what I am about to describe. The myelin disruption was still present. 62% of the targeted pathways were still running at the reduced transmission speed we had induced. This was confirmed. The DSRA had worked mechanically, in the precise sense that it had achieved what it was designed to achieve. What the brain had done was not restore those pathways, it had grown new ones. Not in the sense of new axonal growth. That process takes weeks in human neurology, as in most species. What the brain had done was something finer and faster than that. It had recruited tertiary order connective pathways so thin, so diffuse, so numerically vast in their branching that no suppressions protocol in any discipline targets them, because in every other known species they carry only low-level signal and are not capable of sustained integration. The human brain had found 61 subsidiary channels. I want you to hear that number. 61,000 low-priority distributed, each carrying a fraction of the integration signal, and had organized them into a parallel network that in aggregate was producing coherent, identity-level function. 61,000. Pether-Veln stood at the display panel and pulled up the comparison overlays, the original map, post-null map, the post-draw, and the current state. She said nothing for a long time, then she said, with the flatness of someone who has processed a thing and arrived at its edges, "It's not the same architecture. It's using the whole brain, everything that wasn't the primary system and wasn't the secondary system. All of the tertiary structure, all of it." Stood at that panel for a long time as well. She said, "Do we have a suppression protocol for tertiary distributed architecture?" The answer was no. There is no such protocol. Tertiary distributed identity architecture does not exist in any species we have studied, not as a functional system. It was not thought to be capable of supporting integration at that level of complexity. It is, in the literature of our field, the background noise of neural connectivity, not signal, not purpose-built, not organized. We have never had reason to develop a protocol for it, because it has never, in any species, in any study, in any documented case in the history of this discipline, become signal. I told Pether-Veln to hold the session. Then I told her that what she had seen was to remain internal to the team until I had determined how to proceed. I went into the session room. I sat across the table from Holt. He looked at me with that same present, calibrated attention. He said, "You look tired. I'm sorry if I'm causing problems." I told him he was not causing problems. He said, "Is there any chance of getting that tile game back? The one I had in holding. I could teach you if you wanted. It's not difficult. I've been adapting the rules to 2 players, and I think the modifications are sound." I sat with that for a long time, with the particular quality of that offer, the particular ordinariness of it, with the fact that this man had just had, for the second time in 9 days, his cognitive architecture suppressed by the most advanced tools my field possesses, had rebuilt a functional identity network from the neural equivalent of spare parts. Sitting across from me, asking if I wanted to learn a tile game. I told him I would see about the tile game. He said, "Good. It helps to have something to do." I want to describe, carefully because I think it is the most important part of what I observed, and I think it is the part that the board has not yet fully considered. What I mean when I say that the person who walked out of each suppression procedure was the same person who had walked in. I do not mean that his memories were intact, though they were. I do not mean that his personality was intact, though it was. I mean something more specific than either of those things, and more surprising. Every suppression procedure we know of, when it achieves partial results in non-human species, produces degradation, not just of the specific functions targeted, but of the coherence and integration of the mind in general. A partially suppressed Vethori subject, example, will show the expected reduction in autobiographical access and goal architecture, but will also show reduced verbal fluency, reduced sensory integration speed, reduced capacity for novel reasoning. The brain, when disrupted, degrades. This is the universal finding. This is the principle the entire field is built on. Holt did not degrade. After each reconstitution, his cognitive performance on our standard assessment tasks was identical to baseline. Not recovered to baseline, not compensating for disruption baseline, but baseline, the same verbal reasoning speed, the same pattern task performance, the same working memory capacity. His sleep architecture, monitored continuously, was normal. His stress markers were normal. On day 12, 2 days after the second reconstitution, he scored higher on the abstract pattern assessment than he had on day 1. Higher, Pether Velm noted, than any subject she had assessed in 11 years. She asked me if she had administered the test correctly. I told her she had. He was not recovering from disruption. He was not compensating. The rerouted architecture was performing at the same level as the original, as if the brain, having been forced to use different roads, had found that the different roads were equally good. As if there was no preferred route, as the system had no single correct configuration, only a collection of configurations any of which could support the whole. In 34 species over 32 years, we have never observed anything like this. In 29 years of my own work, I have never observed anything like this. The closest analog in the literature is the behavioral plasticity observed in certain distributed, invertebrate nervous systems, organisms with no central processing structure, where function migrates continuously across the available substrate. Those organisms have no identity, no continuous self, no autobiographical memory. They are not persons. They have plasticity because they have nothing to preserve. Holt had something to preserve. Preservation mechanism was, the only word that fits, structural. Not willpower, not resilience in any motivational sense, not defiance. The brain's physical architecture reconstituted the self because the physical architecture was built to do exactly that, and no tool we possessed could take that property away. In the 2 days between the second reconstitution and my internal review, Pether Velm conducted a literature search. I had not asked her to. She told me about it on day 12, when she came to my office in the early morning before the team had arrived, and set a printed summary on my desk without comment. She had searched the published neurocognitive literature across all 6 Dominion member species, the 3 Carruth-Venn Alliance species, 2 Pelith Institute Stussy species, and the 4 species covered under the Vethori-Orvith Data Sharing Compact. 43 species in all, every sapient species for which any peer-reviewed neurocognitive data existed. She had searched specifically for the following: any documented case of post-suppression identity reconstitution, any documented case of tertiary pathway identity integration, any documented case of subcortical identity integration in a corticated brain, any documented case of post-ITSRA cognitive recovery. The results were as follows: 0 documented cases of post-suppression identity reconstitution in any species, 0 documented cases of tertiary pathway integration at the identity level, 0 documented cases of subcortical identity integration in any corticated sapient species, 2 documented cases of partial post-JARA recovery, both in the Vethri-Carath gray cortex subspecies, both limited to approximately 20% of baseline function, both representing an extreme biological outlier, and both explicitly cited in the DSRA protocol literature as evidence that the technique requires calibration adjustment in gray cortex subjects. 0. Across 43 species, across the complete published literature of our field, across every study and every anomalous result that had been documented and preserved and made available for research. 0. She looked at me and said, "I don't think this is a calibration issue." I told her I had reached the same conclusion. She said, "I also searched for any theoretical work on distributed identity architecture, any model that predicted this kind of redundancy, any researcher who had proposed that the self might be substrate independent within a single brain rather than simply location variable." I asked her what she had found. She said, "One paper. A Vethori theoretical neurocognitivist named Soval Reth published 40 years ago. He proposed, as a purely theoretical exercise, that a sufficiently distributed neural network might support identity integration through aggregate, low-intensity signaling, rather than high-intensity hub-based signaling. He called it the diffuse coherence hypothesis. It was cited 3 times in 40 years, twice by papers dismissing it as biologically implausible, and once by a review article that listed it under historical curiosities. She paused. He died 11 years ago without ever finding empirical evidence for it. I sat with that. Then I said, "I'm a citation. Put it in the findings document." She said, "He was right." I said, "He was right. He deserved to know that while he was alive, and he didn't get to, so the least we can do is put it in the record accurately. She made a note. Then she said, "What we're looking at. The 61,000 tertiary pathways, the distributed load, the fact that it reconstitutes at baseline performance." Soval-Reth's model predicted the mechanism, but not the scale. He thought it might support partial full function. He never imagined it would support full function. He imagined it would support full function at baseline without degradation. She looked at the scan overlays again. The human brain isn't just more plastic than we knew. It's redundant in a way that none of our models account for. Redundant at the level of the whole system. Every pathway is a backup for every other pathway. Every structure is a backup for every other structure. It's not organized like a brain. It's organized like a network that was designed to survive partial destruction. Like something that evolved under conditions where losing pieces of itself was routine. I had not considered that framing. I thought about it. I said, "That is a hypothesis worth writing up separately." She said, "I already started." And she left. I want to include that exchange in the record not because it is scientifically conclusive. Pethler-Vellne's evolutionary hypothesis is speculative and I would not present it as a finding, but because it captures the quality of reasoning, the evidence produced in two experienced scientists who had no prior expectation of these results and no motivation to reach dramatic conclusions. The evidence was simply that unusual. It demanded that kind of thinking. A brain built to survive partial destruction, with redundancy at the system level rather than the component level. If that hypothesis is anywhere near accurate, it explains not only what we observed, but why every suppression technique we attempted failed, and why no technique we currently possess, or could design, within current theoretical frameworks, would succeed. I convened a full internal review on day 13. I presented the findings. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when the people in them are processing. Something that does not fit the categories they have available. Pethler-Vellne said, "We could attempt Tier 3. I want to explain what Tier 3 is, because I want the board to understand that when I say we considered it carefully, and I authorized it with genuine uncertainty, that is accurate. Tier 3, formally, the Deep Pattern Interruption Protocol, classified at the highest restriction level within the Dominion's Cognitive Sciences Directorate, is not a suppression procedure in the ordinary sense. It does not target hub points or connective pathways or myelin architecture. It targets the brain's capacity to maintain electrochemical homeostasis in the cortical layers, most associated with identity integration. It delivers a precisely calibrated disruption to the ionic gradient across a specific membrane complex. A disruption that is self-resolving in most species within 6 to 12 hours, but which, during that window, prevents any coherent high-frequency integration from occurring. The theory was that even a distributed, rerouted identity network requires a minimum electrochemical stability to sustain coherence. Strip that stability, and the network cannot hold pattern, any pattern, long enough to constitute an integrated self. Tier 3 has been used twice. Both uses were in species with unusually complex cognitive architectures, produced a permanent null state within 48 hours. Both subjects remained in null state until end of study. I reviewed both case files before authorizing the procedure. There were no recovery events in either case. There were no documented cases of recovery from Tier 3 in any species. I want to be honest about my reasoning. I told myself that the previous two failures were calibration issues, that the human brain's unusual density and plasticity had found reroutes that my protocols hadn't anticipated, and that Tier 3's different mechanism of action would bypass the rerouting capacity entirely, because it was not targeting a specific pathway, but a universal requirement. No brain, regardless of its architecture, can integrate without electrochemical stability. It was, I told myself, a biological floor that could not be rerouted around. I believed that. I authorized the procedure. Before we ran it on day 14, the day before Tier 3, Pethler-Vellne did something that I want to put in the record, because I believe it reflects a professional judgment that was, in retrospect, correct. She told Holt that we were going to run another assessment procedure the following day. She did not describe it. She did not characterize it. She simply told him, which she was not required to do, and which was not standard protocol. She told me about it afterward and said she had done it because it seemed like the right thing. I noted her reasoning without comment and did not reverse the decision because I agreed with her. Holt thanked her for telling him. He asked, with what she described as genuine, rather than perfunctory interest, now whether she would be present during the procedure. She told him she would be in the monitoring station. He said, "Good. I appreciate that." He then asked if they could finish their tile game that evening, since they had left it mid-round. She said yes. They played for 90 minutes. She won by her account, though she said she suspected he had let her. He denied this, she said, with a very straight face. We ran Tier 3 on day 15. The procedure took 9 hours, the longest application in the protocol's history, because Holt's ionic gradient architecture, like everything else about his brain, was unusually dense and required extended calibration of the disruption field to achieve uniform coverage. Procedure scans confirmed successful disruption of cortical electrochemical homeostasis. Across 94% of the targeted membrane, his integration indices dropped to 0, not near 0, 0. There was nothing on the coherence scan. The scans for the first 6 hours looked like what I expected the final scan to look like. A brain maintaining its biological functions with no integrated self present. I did not go home that night. I slept on a cot in the monitoring station. Pether Veln stayed as well. We watched the scans cycle every 30 minutes. They remained flat. At hour 8, I began to relax in a way I had not relaxed in 2 weeks. At hour 29, Pether Veln touched my shoulder and woke me. I looked at the scan. The coherence index was non-zero. I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing I have to offer the board at this point, and I want to use it wisely. Coherence index at hour 29 was not fully restored. It was at approximately 40% of baseline, but it was present. It was rising on a consistent curve, and the pattern of activity on the scan was not random noise. It was organized. The specific signature of organized activity was unfamiliar to me. Not the primary architecture, not the secondary reroute, not the tertiary distributed network we had documented in the second reconstitution. This was something else. Something I had no framework for. The brain had used the disruption of its own electrochemical homeostasis as a signal, and had responded by shifting the locus of integration to a set structures that, as far as our mapping indicated, had not been playing any significant role in identity-level processing. The brainstem structures, the deep subcortical formations, the oldest parts of the brain evolutionarily speaking, the parts that predate, in Terran paleobiology, the development of the cortex by hundreds of millions of years, parts that in every known species, including humans in every prior study we had reviewed, are responsible for regulatory function, not integration. Heartbeat, breathing, basic arousal states, not identity, not self, not person. In Holt at hour 29 after the most comprehensive cognitive disruption technique in the Dominion's arsenal, those structures were beginning to carry the integrated self. I do not have an adequate scientific explanation for this. I want to be clear about that. I have theories, and I will share them with the board's research committee if asked. But they are theories, not findings. What I can tell you as a finding is this. The human brain appears to have no single location where the self lives. It appears to have no structure, no pathway, no electrochemical process, no architectural feature that is, in itself, the self. The self is a pattern. And the pattern, and this is the part that I believe the board needs to hear most clearly, the pattern appears to be able to run on any sufficiently complex substrate the brain has available. Not on any substrate. On any sufficiently complex substrate. The self is not infinitely plastic. But the human brain is complex enough, distributed enough, dense enough, redundant enough, that we have not, in 2 suppression attempts of escalating severity and 1 application of the most powerful tool we possess, been able to find the floor of that complexity. We have not found the substrate that is insufficient. We have not found the road that cannot be taken. At hour 36, the coherence index crossed 60%. At hour 41, it was at 83. At hour 47, Pether Veln ran a full assessment and found it at 91% of baseline. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, "What do we do?" I told her. "Nothing." We document it, then we go in and talk to him. I want to describe the conversation because I think it is the most important data point in this entire testimony, and I am aware that it is not the kind of data that fits easily into a port. I went into the session room. Holt was sitting at the table. He was not doing anything, not reading, because we had not yet processed the reading material request, not playing with any improvised materials, not pacing. He was simply sitting, with his hands folded on the table, looking at the middle distance. When I came in, he looked at me with that present, calibrated attention. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "What's your name?" I told him. He said, "Orith Selseln, all right." He seemed to be placing it somewhere. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how much time has passed. My internal clock feels off. Can you tell me?" I told him he had been at the facility for 17 days. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had half expected. He said, "More than I thought." He looked at the table for a moment. "I'm hungry. Is there any chance of breakfast?" I told him I would arrange it. He said, "Thank you." Then, as I was turning to go, "Are you all right?" I stopped. I turned back. I asked him why, he asked. He looked at me with a directness that I found in the moment difficult to describe, and still find difficult to describe now. He said, "Because whatever you've been trying to do, you clearly haven't been able to do it, and that looks like it's weighing on you. I'm not trying to be difficult, It seems like the polite thing to acknowledge." I sat down across from him. I sat there for a while. I'm going to tell the board exactly what I said, because I think it is relevant to the conclusions I am about to offer. I said, "I've been trying to understand how you work," he said. "And?" I said, "You are not what we expected." He thought about that. He said, "I'm really not doing anything special," I said. "I know. That's what makes it remarkable." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, not pride, something quieter and more considered. He said, "We're a pretty stubborn species, but not stubborn the way you might mean it. It's not will. It's just." He paused. He seemed to be reaching for a precise formulation, and was taking the time to find it. "It's just how we're built. Something always keeps the lights on. I don't think that's us being brave. I think that's just what we are." I returned to the monitoring station. I sat at my console. Pether Veln waited. I said, "Write it up. All 3 reconstitutions, everything." She said, "What are we recommending?" Thought about it for a long time. Then I told her what I am about to tell this board. I want to describe. Because the board asked me in their pre-testimony briefing to include it. Because I think it is the right thing to include. The conversation I had with the program's oversight director, Vethali Orn, on day 16, the day after the Tier 3 result. Vethali Orn is not a scientist, he is an administrator. He manages the program's liaison function with the Strategic Command and with the Legal Review Directorate. He is a careful man, competent in his domain, and he had reviewed Pether Veln's preliminary documentation before our meeting. He sat across from me in my office, with the expression of someone who has read a report and would prefer that it said something different. He asked me whether we had identified a mechanism for the reconstitution. I told him we had identified the substrate being used, the brainstem and subcortical structures, but that we did not have a mechanism in the sense, a causal explanation for why those structures were capable of carrying identity integration. He asked whether a 4th protocol was feasible. I told him that a 4th protocol would require targeting the subcortical and brainstem structures directly, and that disrupting those structures without destroying the brain's regulatory functions, without killing the subject, was not technically achievable with current instruments. He asked me what that meant in practical terms. I said, "It means the answer to your question is no. 4th protocol is not feasible. What you are describing is not suppression. It is a different category of action." He was quiet for a moment. "Can you be sure the reconstitution is complete? That it is not a partial recovery with some residual deficit we haven't measured?" This is a good scientific question, and I want to answer it here for the board's record as well. The answer is that we administered the full cognitive battery on day 17, 24 hours after the Tier 3 reconstitution had stabilized. Verbal processing, 101% of baseline. Abstract pattern performance, 99%. Working memory, 100%. Novel analogy construction, 103% above baseline, which is consistent with the pattern we observed after the second reconstitution. We administered the battery twice, different instrument operators, to rule out examiner effect. The results were consistent. There was no measurable residual deficit. There was no degradation. The reconstituted system was performing at baseline. The same person by every cognitive metric we possess, present and functioning on day 17 as it had arrived on day 1. Minus approximately 2 weeks that he characterized as feeling like a long dream he couldn't quite remember. I told Vethaliorn this. He was quiet for a longer period. Then he said, "I will need to brief Strategic Command." I told him that was his prerogative. I told him that the program's scientific findings would be filed regardless of whatever administrative decisions followed, and that I intended to testify accurately to this board if called. He said he understood that. He left. I have not spoken with him since. In 31 years of cognitive sciences work, I have suppressed the continuous self in 34 species. I have observed every form of neural degradation that this program's protocols can produce, have mapped the architecture of 41 distinct, sapient brain types, and I have a working knowledge of 7 others through published literature. I know this field. I have spent my career learning where the floor is, learning the minimum substrate required for a self to persist, learning how to reach that floor and remove the self from it. I have reached that floor in every species I have studied. I have not reached it in this one. The human brain does not appear to have an identity floor that is accessible to our tools. It does not appear to have a structural anchor for the self that can be isolated and disrupted. The self is not in the cortex, or rather it is. It is not only in the cortex, it is not in the primary integration nodes, or it is, but it is not only there. It is not in the high-density connective pathways, or in the electrochemical homeostasis of the cortical membranes, or in the subcortical structures. It is in all of those places, and it can move between all of those places. And it appears. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to overstate, but I also do not want to understate. It appears to be in some fundamental sense a property of the system as a whole, rather than of any part of the system. To erase the self from a human brain using our current technology, you would need to suppress not a hub, not a pathway, not an electrochemical process, but the entire system simultaneously, completely, and irreversibly. You would, in practical terms, need to kill the brain. Not the person, in the sense of their heartbeat or their breathing. Those we could certainly interrupt and restore as needed. Basic life support technology, the brain, the whole brain all at once, beyond any threshold of recovery. Short of that, the self comes back. I have said this to myself in various formulations over the past 3 weeks, trying to find the one that captures it most precisely. The one I keep returning to is this. You cannot perform targeted suppression on a system that has no preferred target. The human brain's identity architecture is not a building with load-bearing walls. It is a network with no single point of failure. Every suppression technique we possess works by finding the load-bearing wall, the hub, the pathway, the chemical key, and removing it. The human brain has no load-bearing wall. It has distributed load across the entire structure, and when you remove any part of it, the load shifts. Not because the human wills it to shift, not because the human is fighting. The load shifts because that is what the architecture does. That is what it was built to do, over whatever span of evolutionary time produced it, and it does it as automatically and as thoughtlessly as a heart beats. I am not telling the board that human beings are indestructible. I am not telling the board that human beings cannot be harmed, cannot be killed, cannot be affected by any intervention we might choose to make. Those statements are false. Human beings are mortal, fragile in many ways that their other physiological characteristics may obscure, and subject to the same biological constraints as any organic species. What I am telling the board is narrower and more precise, and I think it is more important for that precision. Within the specific domain of cognitive identity suppression, within the specific field that is, using the best tools that the Dominion and its allies have produced in 40 years of dedicated research, I cannot suppress the self of a human being on a permanent basis without destroying the organ that produces it. I have tried. I have tried with escalating tools and escalating durations and escalating sophistication. The self comes back. It comes back through different routes each time. It comes back using structures we did not know could carry it. It comes back at near baseline performance without degradation or diminishment. And it does all of this without any deliberate effort on the part of the person it belongs to. It comes back because the design of the human brain makes it come back. Because that design has no single point that can be removed. I have one final observation, and then I will answer the board's questions. On day 18, the day before Holt was transferred back to detention authority custody, pending the legal review that I understand is ongoing, to see him for the last time. Not as a scientist, I want to be honest about that. I went because I thought he deserved a conversation that was not also an assessment. He was playing the modified two-player version of the tile game with Pether Veln, who had taken him up on the offer several days earlier and had, by her own admission, become moderately invested in the game. He looked up when I came in, he said, "She's better at this than she thinks." Pether Veln made a sound that combined skepticism and acknowledgement in equal measure. I sat with them for a while. Then, I told Holt that I thought he was going to be returned to standard custody soon, and that I wanted to apologize for what we had attempted. He thought about that for a moment. He said, "You were trying to understand something. You didn't hurt me in any way I can point to." He paused. "Did you learn what you wanted to learn?" I told him I had learned more than I had wanted to. He smiled at that, a brief, genuine smile, the kind that acknowledges an honest thing without needing to comment on it. He said, "That's usually how it goes with us." I said, "I believe it." He picked up a tile. He looked at it. He said, and I believe he meant it simply, without any particular weight, "We can't really help it. Being what we are, it just keeps going." I said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would have added anything. Board has asked me to provide a recommendation. I will provide one, and it is this. The Dominion's Cogfoster program should not be applied to human subjects. Not because of ethical considerations alone, though those are real and should be addressed separately. Because the program cannot succeed with its current tools at any level of severity short of total neural destruction, and the attempt to push it to that level would constitute a different action than suppression. It would constitute execution performed with the vocabulary of science. The program was not designed for that, was not authorized for that, and should not be made into that. The finding, the scientific finding, separate from the policy recommendation, is that the human brain's identity architecture has no accessible suppression floor. With the methods we possess, the self distributes, the self reroutes, the self reconstitutes. Not because humans are exceptional in any way they would claim for themselves. Not because of will, or training, or courage, or any quality of character. Because the brain that produces the human self appears to have been shaped, over whatever span of time, and whatever sequence of pressures shaped it, into something for which we have no adequate technical description. It is the only architecture I have encountered in 31 years that I am confident I do not fully understand. That confidence, that precise, uncomfortable, professionally humbling confidence, is the most important conclusion I can offer this board. I am ready for your questions. The board took a recess of 40 minutes. When we reconvened, the chair, Senior Adjudicator Vethali Korn, whom I have known professionally for 12 years and who is one of the most precise legal minds in the Dominion's Review Directorate, asked me 3 questions. I will record them, and my answers here, because they are part of the testimony and should be preserved. The first question was this. Had I considered the possibility that Holt was a biologically exceptional individual, and that the reconstitution events were attributable to individual variation, rather than species-level characteristics? I told the board that this was the first explanation I had considered, and that I had investigated it thoroughly. The structural density we observed in Holt's initial neural map, the unusual hub point count, the inter-hub connective density, the map Pether Veln described as a city rebuilt twice on the same foundation, was at the upper end of documented human variation, but not pathologically so. It fell within the range we had characterized from our cadaver specimens and from the published human neuroimaging literature. More importantly, the reconstitution mechanism itself, The 61,000 tertiary pathway recruitment, the subsequent subcortical integration, was not a function of his individual density. It was a function of the architecture type. Tertiary pathway network is present in all human brains. The subcortical structures are present in all human brains. The question is not whether Holt had unusual resources available to him. The question is whether those resources, when activated by the specific pressure of suppression, respond in the way we observed. And everything about the neurological mechanism suggests that they would in any human brain with comparable overall complexity. We do not have a control group. I will be honest about that. But the mechanism is not idiosyncratic. The mechanism is structural and species typical. Vethali Korn noted my answer and asked the second question, had I considered that a longer application of Tier 3, an extended disruption window, might have produced a permanent null state rather than a temporary one? I told him that I had considered it, and that I had consulted with the two researchers who had authored the prior Tier 3 case files. Both researchers concluded that an extended application was theoretically possible, but would carry a high probability of crossing into permanent neurological damage, not at the identity integration level, but at the regulatory level, which would constitute killing the subject by incremental organ failure rather than direct termination. One of the researchers, asked not to be identified in the record, said, "We would be crossing from suppression science into something that does not have a clean name, and I am not comfortable putting my name on the protocol." The other said, more simply, "You would not be performing a longer suppression. You would be performing a slower execution." I endorsed both characterizations. I told Vethali Korn that I was not prepared to recommend that approach, and that I did not believe the program's authorizing mandate covered it. He noted the answer and asked the third question, what did I believe the strategic significance of these findings was? This is not a question I was prepared for, and I want to be honest about that. I am a scientist. Strategic analysis is not my discipline. He asked the question directly, and I owed him a direct answer, so I gave him the one I had arrived at. Over 17 days of watching those scan results, I said, the strategic significance is this: every detention, suppression, and non-cognitive alteration program the Dominion operates is built on a shared assumption that a sufficiently advanced tool can reach the core of a sapient self and alter or remove it. That assumption has been validated in 34 species. It has been invalidated in one. The one species for which it has been invalidated is also. I do not need to complete that sentence for anyone in this room. What I can say, scientifically, is that the human self is organized in such a way that targeting it requires destroying the whole system. Any program or strategy premised on partial, reversible, or targeted cognitive alteration of human subjects should be aware that they are not operating in the domain they think they are operating in. They are not suppressing. They are not altering. They are doing nothing at all, at any level of sophistication currently available to us. And the subject will go home with everything they arrived with. The board adjourned without further questions. Vethali Korn told me my testimony was thorough, and that the board's deliberations would proceed in closed session. He thanked me for my precision. I thanked him for the question about strategic significance. I told him it had forced me to say aloud something I had been circling for 3 weeks, and that saying it aloud had been clarifying. He asked me what I meant by that. I told him, I have spent 31 years trying to find the floor in things, the minimum substrate, the point below which a self cannot persist. In 34 species I found it. In one species I did not. That is not a failure of the program. That is the most important finding the program has ever produced, and possibly the most important finding in the history of this field. He said, and that knowledge, does it change how you think about them? I thought about Holt sitting at the table with his hands folded, asking if I wanted to learn a tile game. I thought about Petherveln and the tile pieces she had procured from the recreation supplies in her slightly defensive tone. I thought about the scan at hour 29, the coherence index rising on its steady, untroubled curve, the brain going about its work, as though nothing unusual had occurred, as though reconstituting the self from 61,000 spare channels was simply the next item on the list. I thought about what Holt had said. We can't really help it. Being what we are, it just keeps going, I told Vethalicorn. Yes, considerably. He nodded once and the session closed.